ProFarmer confirms a lower yield for corn in the United States. Jerry Gidel is going to talk about it right here on Connected Farmer. So, Jerry, we have had our crop tour through central Illinois. We saw a little bit of the Indiana crops, and the ProFarmer tour has confirmed what we have seen, and it seems that we are going to see a lower crop and much lower than what the USDA is estimating at this point.
Yes, it was quite an eye-opener. To some extent, it started out on both ends with Ohio uh, and South Dakota. One was too dry. South Dakota had the yields down. Well, they had just a garden spot last year, so now they're getting back into more reality of what tends to be the case with the dryness, and it was actually a little bit more than normal. And they had estimates there. In the 149, 150 zone versus well the I think the trade a year ago was 165 and that turned into 175 at the end type situation. Ohio, the other side of the country, uh, immature, not the lengths of grain length and things like that, and at respectable 180-ish type of number, but that isn't the 195 the USDA. Now, to some extent, they really were depending upon the producers out there to project their yields and things like that. And that's always an interesting scenario early in the season where producers look at the outside just like everybody else does. Doesn't always go in and do those yield checks. And to some extent, in early August, sometimes they can be quite deceptive. You don't have the crop isn't far enough along. You can't really judge what the final yield might be by just pulling some early ears out there. The one thing that our tour definitely did and always does is it does make that trip into the crop field, and that's the thing that we kind of pointed out as from on our trip from last weekend was the fact that even in central Illinois, we had a 5 bushel less than the year before, and that wasn't projections of what was going on with the uh, participants out there. And to some extent, that's what their involves on it from there. But as we go through this tour situation, Indiana had some issues too. We saw that in our little Fort stop situation. Oh, Nebraska was solid, but nothing spectacular. From there, it didn't have this 190-ish. We had yields in the areas that we go through, and even the USDA's primary stuff is in the eastern third to irrigation. And irrigation can make a big difference. But as we hit the major states of Illinois and Iowa, things definitely, in both cases here, slip back. Our mid uh, Illinois estimates, as I said, were down five. The numbers that came out of the ProFarmer tour were startling, in my opinion. Uh, the areas around central Illinois, the eastern, well, we do parts of central and eastern from there, but the interestingly enough, there's just a little bit of estimates out there in the 190s uh, in that uh, in District 2, which is really around Chicago, and in distant in District 6 was also in there, but they had just modest numbers of entries in that. So the reality of it is what we saw in Central Illinois being down was across the whole northern two-thirds of the state, which is really the primary corn producing area. And in Iowa, the 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 two big states, well, the whole western part of Iowa is basically a very good producing area, and those yields out there were in the 190, 193s and stuff like that. 189 to 192, I think it was in their numbers, which is not the place to see a 212 U.S. yield. And there was some good stuff in Northeast Iowa, but that's the number of acres there didn't make up for it. And so, in general, their overall number here is uh, was interesting and makes a big difference here uh, on things as we go forward. The grain length here, I think ear length, if you want to call it that, is was down significantly right across the board here, and that's really comes back to I think they keep pointing to the cool weather of June and the hot weather of July combining together to some extent reduce the grain link. I think some of the dryness of August to or excuse me, of May might have a factor there. But you put them all together, if the tip back and the combination of the years to begin with is this isn't strong enough, that's a big factor because even the ear counts weren't dramatically lower and over, but they were lower. And you put those two together, that's how you can end up having some surprising things. Soybeans, our look at the soybeans along the way here was yeah, cursory because of the wet weather and we were seeing and that, and also the amount of moisture that was in the fields at this point, be that made the edge of the rows, tough to get into. Plus, there were just a lot of times we go over and look at, and there's water still staying in the rows, and that's not good to make a bean count along the way. Their tour situation also had less numbers on that, and I think that's uh, surprisingly the final numbers that they put out for the ProFarmer tour were up a little bit, but they were really optimistic about the August rains really jumping back. Some of the, not so much the pod count, but maybe the weights on things, and maybe a few more pods in some cases. But in general, uh, their final numbers here, final August crop tour numbers, were up slightly here to 53.3 versus USDA at 52.7. And in the corn, they were way down at 153. And that's maybe a tad aggressive. Things could bounce back a little bit with some of this moisture, but in general here, that 153 number, talking about a second or third crop, size wise, but that's because of the big plantings. If you look at the actual yield potential, these are numbers we had back in the in the early 2000s and things like that. Basically, until 2 years ago, we had not taken out the 180 number, and and I'm not sure about the USDA's number for last year at 186. Probably will be reduced back because of what we're seeing on our Indian carryover stocks on corn here in the U.S. Likely to be uh, non-sustainable versus the yield number they are using right now. So, interesting tour and the general point of view here at this point. Definitely got lots of controversy going out there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you think the market is buying the USDA number or the ProFarmer number?
Oh, I think they're gonna prime the direction of the Pro Farmer Tour. When you have a significant adjustment like Pro Farmer put out there at 173 versus the, for practical purposes, a 180 number, it makes people a little gun shy. But I think their initial reaction here is going to still end up taking out the recent highs here in the low, like the seven, excuse me, the $5 level, and uh, there's a potential of this thing over the next few days to moving up towards the 540, 545 level on things because of the uncertainty of this thing. But the one thing is interesting about this, if uh, putting their pro farmer data in here into our supply demand numbers in that and not making any adjustments on numbers of acres. And after last year, everybody's thinking there's always going to be an increase in the planned acres. The farmers are telling us they don't they're not telling us about the plantings because you establish that trend last year, you kind of get it in people's minds from there. But at the same time, uh, uh, we're not potentially here going to pull back our demand numbers so much. And right now, if we end up taking the just utilizing the pro farmers numbers, you take off a number here on production of 650 million bushels. That's hard to ignore. Even if you take 100 million off of exports and 150 off of feed demand, you're still going to have a number here on a carryover stock for the coming year under 1.3. And that's been a magic number here in the past for some strengthening markets. Now, I don't think that the world, particularly right ahead of harvest, that they're going to believe that kind of, that they're going to price a market at that level, which it has been in the past. So that from there, the first thing is going to be is more uh, harvest results and things like that. And also, at this point, at least, the Chinese have been buyers in the beans. They were a buyer of beans on Friday for them. Well, they officially bought 750,000 in their name. There was a 750,000 ton unknown. To some extent, you want to throw those all under the China umbrella. And that's going to actually, of all things, take us up to around 7.5 to maybe even close to 8 million metric tons on purchases here for and that's been an interesting twist since in this whole thing, everybody's been very cautious that they say they're going to, well, the agreement is they're supposed to buy 250 million beans, and maybe they will, maybe they won't, but that's what's got everybody gun shy about putting that into their estimate. But right now, at least, the potential for the Chinese to be around here supporting the beans. Because today's bean numbers, when you put together a slightly higher number than we had last month, and even if you increase a little bit more in exports, the USDA isn't likely to take the carryover stock down below the previous month on beans and maybe even edge it up a little bit, uh, 30 million or something like that. It's it, the markets are still going to be quite volatile here and listening to all what's going on in the Mid East and things of that nature here on things, but definitely to some extent there's still people that feel like that the pro farmer is just an advocate for the farmer, but I think they're advocate for themselves. I think they're not out to uh, put out stuff that they didn't see or didn't happen or things like that. And I think it's the other side of the coin. Some of the farmers out there don't always make the trip into the into the field to really look at it. And as we saw, things weren't as rosy as the green crops were on the outside. And then we unfortunately couldn't see the beans so much with all the wet weather that happened on our tour last weekend.
To some extent, I think the market has bought a little bit of this reduction because of the recent bounce in the prices.
Oh, yeah, they bought. Well, you can't really ignore some of the data that was coming out, and particularly after Illinois came in with their averages here uh, in the overall two-thirds of the state that they really do a good job of. And you can't. Illinois is such a huge state along the top. You can't do any better than care of the top two-thirds of it. And once that came along, I think that really. Uh, you know cause people to keep an eye on it. Iowa had respectable stuff. Minnesota actually kind of hung in there and did its job of uh, having a good yields and stuff like that in their statistics. But the dryness of the plains, I don't think got totally understood in South Dakota and North Dakota, and the immaturity and the in the East and Indiana, Ohio came in. So no, I think it's going to be respected, but I would have to say that probably moves back up into the 550 zone, which has been a long time resistance point in here. Probably are going to be uh, respected for a while. The other big thing happening in this situation is well, this is all going on, and this is not the time of year to rally grain prices going into harvest, but at the same time, the issues, if we get further attacks going on, um, but in Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine actually tried to end up proposing some kind of ceasefire or at least reduction of each other bombing their most important exporting facilities. And the Russians just ignored that. So I'm not sure where that's going. If that escalates further. Uh, right now, there's talk that Russia and Ukraine have hardly did any exports during the month of August. It's one of their biggest months that well, it's the beginning of their fall push. And if you're not exporting, that means things are not well supplied out there. And that means you look to the U.S. Well, the U.S. doesn't have the crop it had that everybody thought we had. So there you go. Things are changing all the time. Then you put in the Iranian and U.S. conflict and whether that's really an oil related thing. It's not an agricultural situation, but it's that situation going on. That just adds to the emotions of these markets. And so, right now, at least, the short term, we could rally into some important and tough areas, but there's still lots of things out there to make this market very emotional going on into September.
All right, sir. Thank you very much.
Take care and definitely a interesting work for us and the ProFarmer people. We did our tours of the Midwest uh, cornfields and soybean fields.